Morning, guys. Lenny Reed, Dynomite Diesel, and I'm here with Donnie Walker. Donnie Walker is the new guy that's upstairs taking phone calls, emails, things like that. So fresh on the phones. Donnie came for me. Well, actually, I met Donnie. He's been a buddy of mine. We did some Jeeping and things like that. He's kind of new to diesel, but he's not new to automotive. He does a lot of hobbying in the garage, things like that. So he's picking it up, but give him some time. And since he's fresh, since a lot of you guys are fresh, I wanted to bring him on camera, introduce him to you, and I wanted to make sure that some of the questions you're getting, we can introduce those questions to the people, discuss those questions, and sort of all learn together at one time.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I spend a lot of time getting tough questions that I just kind of run downstairs to get you on the phone so that you can either help them out or tell me what to say to help them out. And sometimes I lose a little bit of that in translation, so I think that's good.
We definitely, I've been in this industry. I started doing pickup truck repair and whatnot in 2000. So, right at 20 years now.
Yeah, it's a long
time. Half my life. Just almost half my life. Raised my kids on it.
Nobody knows how old you are.
They don't need to. 30. No, my vision says I'm super old, so I'm like, 46. Anyways, you've been getting some questions, and some of the old P-pump stuff is fairly difficult. I know that I get people on the phone, and before they tell me what truck, they start telling me about their problem.
Yeah.
And I have very little patience, so I try to go, hey, hold on. What's the year, make, and model of the truck? And they're still going blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, hold on, pump the brakes, because my brain works. I've seen so many problems that are chronic to each and every brand and style of injection pump. So before I can hear all of the blah, 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 Bart Simpson's like teacher, I have to hear what the truck is. And once I hear what the truck is, then my brain goes, oh, we're back into that gear. And then I start thinking of chronic problems of that truck. And then they have to restart with all the blah, blah, blah again, because I didn't hear any of it.
Yep.
Like, until I hear your make, model, and then I'm already like, okay, P-pump. We're going to talk primarily about P-pump today because it's getting to be pretty old. I used to be really, really, really good at it. I enjoyed it a lot. Having a dyno was critical for that thing, because with every single different injection pump, like, it was put together by a different guy than all the rest of them to a spec. And then it got put in pin to pin per se, plastic pin in the dowel of the crankcase, plastic pin in the injection pump, and it was pin timed to say 14.3 degrees. But if you checked it with like a caliper, we used to have a dial indicator, we would look at all the timing. That would vary from like say 11 to about 15 and a half degrees. And back then, when you would take like say a 96, 97, 98 truck, put it on the dyno, some of them were anemic and some of them actually ran pretty good. And that was basically because, like, mechanically, like, Bosch is building the injection pump, Chrysler is putting the truck together, Cummins put the motor together, it all got assembled pin to pin. They weren't the same. It wasn't like a common rail, which is actually pretty close. Like, you dyno a half dozen common rails, they're all really close.
Right.
Mechanical stuff just wasn't the same way. So, got to learn a lot about, fuel plates and governor springs and Android, little boost elbow for the turbochargers, AFC springs. I want to show you some of this stuff. I want to explain how some of this stuff works. I want to show you guys the exact same things. Let's start with P-pump. Like, when somebody calls you up, have you been hit yet in the past 2 weeks with, I have a P-pump, and then you're automatically supposed to just know everything about it?
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, I think we all heard that, maybe you were an adult, you had to have P-pump Cummins. It's a P-pump Cummins, that's the best one you could have. And I always just thought they were all the same thing. And until actually one day we sat down and opened up a P-pump and we installed each one of these parts into it, specifically obviously on the boost elbow. That really helped me understand exactly what went into that. As far as, I didn't know what it was. For all I knew, it could have been the shape of a P. People call and tell me they have a P-pump, and the first thing I ask is, well, which P-pump do you have? And they say, well, it's from a second-gen Dodge, it's a P-pump. And that isn't really the whole story, and I have to kind of help guide them to get to how they can find out. But for the most part, what you've told me is year and transmission really goes a long way, if it is still the factory pump.
Yeah. So, because you walk downstairs and then you're like, hey, Len, the first few times you walk in, you're like, hey, dude, this guy's got a P-pump. And I'm like, what pump? 160, 175, 180, 215, because I don't know what gear I'm supposed to be in yet. Like, which pump is it? Well, it's a P-pump. And I'm like, dude, go find out which P-pump.
Right.
There's a Bosch 10 digit. There's an ID tag. If you unbolt the throttle linkage, 3 10mm bolts, throttle linkage falls off. You can reach in there with a mirror, or nowadays, like back in the old day I couldn't, but now you can reach out with your cell phone, take a picture of it, blow it up, and then you got all 10 digits. You can Google those 10 digits and it'll pull up like which horsepower that pump came from. So by chance, if you have a truck that was, bought to you third, fourth, fifth hand, the motor may have got swapped out, the injection pump may have got swapped out, somebody may have taken the pump off from damage, sent in, and then they got the improper pump back for that application. It's that easy. Take a picture of that ID tag, look it up, and in the P-pumps, so you got your 160, your 175, and those were 94, 95 trucks. The 160 had the automatic transmission, and the 175 had the 5-speed transmission. Then you got your 96, 97, 98, early 98, not 98 and a half, because that turned to a 24 valve.
Right.
96, 97, 98. If you had a 5-speed, you had a 215 pump, which is what I would call the holy grail. That's like the 427 Corvette, like barn find. And then the automatic trucks had 180 injection pump. There's a lot of differences in the pumps, and the earlier ones with the exact same bolt-ons will not perform like a 215. So if somebody's trying to build something kind of on a budget, but they want a real hot rod, I always recommend you go find a 215 core, start with that, and it'll pump the best, it'll work the best on kind of a budget. If you're throwing out the camshaft, throwing out a bunch of the other parts, and then gonna build a pump to your spec, it doesn't matter what you start with. It's just the housing, and all the housings look identical, but then whoever puts together and calibrates your pump, there's a lot of really good pump shops that do this stuff. They're gonna, when they go through and set timing, they can tell you at how many millimeters a lift is gonna be X amount of degrees of timing.
Yep. I actually just got the phone guy earlier that told me the entire spec of the pump that he just got.
Okay.
And included all that.
That's really good information, because when they're asking us for, and he obviously doesn't need any of these pump parts because he just got his pump built, but he's probably asking you about injectors, I assume. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to need to see more about his injection pump and his turbocharger, his transmission, and his torque converter. Why his torque converter?
Yeah.
Stall speed is very important when you're choosing turbochargers. If you try to put a really tight converter in it, so you want to harness all the power down low, enjoy your 3 little tiny turbos to drive that torque converter off the bottom. Elevation of a P-pump is really important, because when you pin time it, when you set timing, you're going to set it, say 21 degrees, 25 degrees, whatever you choose. It's static timed at that forever. At all RPM ranges, it's always going to be at 21 degrees. It's always going to be at 24. No matter what the RPM range. And at that degree of timing, it has its sweet spot in the power curve where it really likes to live, and it hates some of the other RPMs.
Right.
With a common rail, I'm going to idle at -8 degrees, and then as RPM and load increase, I'm going to end up at 25 degrees. Oh, okay, that's great. But now it actually drives. It drives off the bottom. You put a tight converter in them, and you retard the heck out of the timing, which puts a bunch of heat in the turbine of the turbocharger, and it drives the charger off the bottom. If you called your tuner and said, hey, I want you to set my timing in my truck at 21 degrees, I've got a common rail set all the way at 21 degrees, you'd be like, wow, this thing's not that fun anymore. You'd be driving driving an electronically controlled P-pump.
Right.
You don't do that.
Which
Nobody
would be
does
great
that.
for just a really small RPM range.
You'd have about 500 or 600 RPM where it was like really happy, and then the others it wouldn't be very happy. You'd go to start the truck at 21 degrees, and it would be like coughing and sputtering and doing stupid stuff that it doesn't do, because your tuner isn't going to just pick one timing map and just say, oh, I'm going to set it all here. Like, that doesn't happen. So yeah, like with all these little P-pump parts, why do we have them where we have 160, 175s? They've got some different governor weights in them. They've totally got a different camshaft in them. It's not very efficient at high RPM. So when somebody calls up and they're like, hey, I got a 160 or 175, and I plan on spinning, a 71 millimeter turbo, and I'm like, stop, hold on, like, pump the brakes. The camshaft, picture an inline, picture your Cummins motor torn apart. You basically have your crankshaft with X amount of stroke, and it has a connecting rod. Well, we're going to bypass the connecting rod because we're sitting on top of a plunger, and in this, just above the plunger, there's a galley in the pump. it fills into that little chamber, and as soon as the piston comes up, passes that, now whatever fluid is above that plunger, the 12 or 13 millimeter plunger, is going to be shoved through delivery valve holder, injection line into injector. Whatever doesn't get injected hits the side of the injector and then returns back to the tank. At big RPM, the camshaft that's in a 160 and 175, there's not enough fill time in there, and there's not enough time on the clock to get very much fluid to fall on top of the plunger, so they really start diminishing performance at high RPM. If you've got a 71 millimeter turbo, it's not going to be happy until it starts to see some RPM. So about the time your injection pump's starting to throw its shoulders forward and fall off, your turbocharger's starting to sing and be happy. So those two things just don't work well. Oh, I've got a 215 pump, a 71 millimeter turbo, I'm still listening. Like, and I live at 5,000 feet, and I want a daily driver, and blah, 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 blah. Okay, hold on. The turbo's not really gonna light at 5,000 feet, but my buddy with a 6.7 Cummins drives the heck out of this turbo. Your buddy with a 6.7 has more displacement, way better cylinder head flow, response from all of the deshrouding of the valves because of a bigger bore. He's moving more air, and again, he gets to pick his timing, and he can run at -8 degrees as he's putting around the parking lot in the Safeway, and then as he pulls out and starts standing on the gas pedal, it goes from -8 to -6 to -5, 0, and then starts advancing timing, so he can drive a 71 millimeter turbo. You and your like P-pump, not so much. It's not the same rig. So you really want to make sure that when you're putting together a P-pump truck, all of the parts line out. Torque converter, gearing, turbochargers, injection pump, all that stuff needs to line up to make it a very pleasurable driving experience. And they can be very pleasurable, but one missed component and it turns the whole thing into a bag.
I have had that question before. People call and say, well, what do I really need? Because they think that they can pick and choose from a bag of parts and it's going to still work up to what they think it should. But in reality, it really is all of it. It's a recipe, and it's like making a cake without the eggs. It's going to be kind of a cake, but it's not going to be really good.
And the eggs are the only thing that are protein in the cake. Right?
Yeah.
That's how I justify eating cake.
That's like, not my thing.
Yeah. So with that being said, when they call up and they say, hey, I've got a list of stuff, I need you to tell me about the injectors, and I usually say, go to the custom injector form, fill that sucker out, let me look at it. I look at the paper for about 30 seconds, yes, no, yes, maybe, never tried it. And then I can get on the phone, talk to them and say, well, here's what we can do, here's what we can't do, here's why it won't work, here's the how comes. Because I would way rather be in a situation where if it's not gonna work, I warn the customer on the front side and let them know why. Torque converter is gonna be too tight, turbocharger is gonna be too big, injection pump's gonna fall off too early, whatever it is, it is. But if we build them a set of injectors and they're disappointing the way the truck performs, at that moment, I want to be able to be like, hey, look, I want to print the race sheet, and then I look at that and I go, yeah, but did you change torque converter? Because we had a discussion, you said you were going to loosen up the converter. I didn't do that. Is it really that important? Yes, it's really that important.
Right.
So trying to make any of these trucks junk is extremely easy. Trying to make them all really good takes experience. And with the experience, you got to pay attention along the way. Like I say, I've been doing this for 20 years. Back when I first started, like one of the very first tools that I bought was a dyno, and I learned like 2 degrees of timing, worked. EGT would drop, power would go up. 2 more degrees, EGT would go up, power would fall. There'd be a big belly in the front side of the curve where it didn't want to light, and then it screamed up top, and then it fell off because it ran out of turbocharger. We have recommendations on our website for certain size of injectors, and it says like this injector will support X amount of power. Well, to get to that kind of power, you're going to need about this many degrees of timing anyway.
Right.
And then the old thing used to be, back in the old day before you were born, there was a magazine called the Turbo Diesel Register, and if you didn't get the TDR monthly, and if you weren't on the TDR's forum, you just weren't a cool guy. And in the TDR, there was always guys going, man, 15, 16 degrees, you'll never need more timing than 15, 16 degrees. Injectors back then were tiny. We street drive injectors today that are massively bigger than the stuff that was available back then. Anytime you shove a given quantity of diesel doesn't flash like gas. So since there is a bit more burn time required in diesel, if I fill this cup with diesel, and let's just say that it burns off in the atmosphere in about 2.5 to 3 minutes with this much fluid. I put a bigger injector in there, it's going to be like, say, 20% bigger with the same injection, input. Now I've got 20% more fluid. Theoretically, it's going to take about 20% more time to actually burn that. If we don't advance the timing and complete the injection event early enough,
Before the valve opens.
before the exhaust valve comes and the camshaft says time to open, then all of the energy ends up getting wasted and it turns into black hydrocarbons that just go through the turbine housing, out the exhaust system. You miss out on a bunch of throttle response, you miss out on all the power, and the mileage is not very good usually. Too much timing? Yes, you can have too much timing, absolutely. How do you get it figured out? Well, again, I've done enough with these injectors that I can kind of recommend, like you're gonna, and depending on what you've done to your injection pump and who's calibrated it, you're gonna get different quantities of fuel out of your injection pump compared to a stalker. That's why we say, these are gonna be good from like 18 to 20 degrees, or say, 20 to 22 degrees, or 24 to 27 degrees. That's the starting point, but if you've already done a bunch of the work to the injection pump, that totally throws out the idea of me being able to tell you exactly what you need to do, because if you've got a pump that's pumping 850 mm or cc's, that changes things, and I need to know that. So if you're building some hot rod, we need to have you fill out that race waiver or the custom injector sheet on the website, so I can know that when I'm speccing out the injectors. We have changed a lot with the injectors in the past few months. Instead of the old day where we just run media through, we would add too much K factor and they got really efficient, but you start to lose some of the actual spray angle and they would get too smoky. So we're limited in size on just extrude hone only. We had some nozzles made with bigger spray orifices to start out with, and then we would take those spray orifices, add K factor, and it turned out to be a pretty good injector. With some of the experiments that we've done here recently, I sent a set of 10-hole, 70-liter a minute injectors, so that's, I'm going to say 250% over, something like that, to a guy in Texas who works inside of an injection pump shop. He's had some of our old parts, basically everybody on the planet, and he's like, man, I don't know what y'all did out there, but this truck's never ran this good.
I actually took that phone call. He thought it was magic. He just basically said, I don't know what magician you had build these or how he did it, but this is absolutely unreal.
It's the same concept and the same idea that we're working on the patent. We're doing it on the 6.7s, we're doing it on the bunch of Chevy stuff, the Duramax stuff. It's the same concept, but different hole size, obviously, because they're a totally different thing. That being said, with what we gave him, the atomization is a lot better than just 5 really monstrous holes.
Right.
Better atomization. Atomization is the word that everybody uses, and it's kind of a blanket term. If you read a book from like the SAE or from Bosch, they would call it droplet sizing. So when the fuel leaves the nozzle, they would call all of those little atomized particles droplets. The smaller the hole, the better, the smaller the droplet sizing is. The larger the hole, the further the droplet will travel before it actually sees enough heat and ignites. If you break down the fuel through a smaller hole, the droplet sizing decreases as well, and it ignites earlier. So it doesn't travel as far to the piston before it actually ignites. It ignites at its furthest point away from the nozzle. It doesn't ignite at the nozzle. It ignites at its furthest point traveled, and then it burns back to the nozzle. So with what we're doing with multiple holes and multiple size holes, we're giving that piston a lot more time of burning before the exhaust valve opens, so we're increasing the efficiency. We've already noticed a lot of people are talking about mileage, start ability, like cold start first thing in the morning, and then if you try and drive one around town, just pulling off stoplights and things like that, they feel a lot more torquey without having to stand on the gas pedal, because you're actually we've just given you a lot more time of burn time before camshaft tells the exhaust valve to open. It's pretty cool stuff.
And in reality, your only other option is to increase pressure, because you're using a static pressure pump. You can't change that. So we have to make the hole smaller.
The only thing The only way you can increase or enhance droplet sizing is decrease hole size or increase pressure. That is the only two things on the planet that will do that. So I'm glad that you caught that, because these guys need to know that. As RPM increases, compression increases, and so will the pressure, because the speed and the velocity of the piston coming up start to increase pressure. A P-pump will inject fluid at about 2 times what its nozzle opening pressure is set at idle. So if you've got the nozzle opening pressure set at 270 bar, it's going to idle with about 270 times 2. At wide open throttle, you'll start to run into plunger and barrels sticking from too much heat and too much friction at about 10 times. So it'll be like 10 times 270 bar is the most line pressure you're ever going to see. With later style column rails, we bury those pressures, because now we're, some of these things are at 225, 230, 240 like MPa.
Yeah.
So, in the low 30s for 30,000 pounds of pressure, we can get away with a lot better droplet sizing because of the increase in pressure. So, yeah, let's talk about some of your questions. What do you got for questions that customers hit you with?
So, one of the original ones we just went over is how to identify the P-pump. And so we just talked about finding your serial number, or at least telling me the year, make, and model, what transmission it had in it. That way we can kind of hope that it's the factory one, which you told me it's about $3,000 for a new injection pump. So for the most part, they're either just going to have it rebuilt, or they're going to get one from the same truck.
The only reason I would see anybody ever like replacing an injection pump is if they were, these trucks are not 25 years old.
Yeah.
They could have been traveling somewhere, they went somewhere, they ingested water, they needed to get the truck back on the road as fast as possible. They might have rolled into a Dodge dealer or somebody's garage that possibly had an injection pump there on the shelf, and they could have just swapped out the pump in exchange. Otherwise, the P-pump's pretty reliable, and most people will choose to pull the pump out of the truck, send it to the pump shop, have their recipe, talk to their pump guy, get a consultation on that, build the injection pump the way they want it, and then the original pump lands back in the truck. Is that a promise? No. A lot of people, they know that 215 pumps are really good. So again, if you're unsure of the injection pump and it's original, if you look at the flange bolts, where the bolts, there's 4 14 millimeter or 15 millimeter nuts that hold the injection pump to the back of the gear case housing. The color that came on the pickup truck was called Bluke, B-L-U-K-E, or something like that. And it was the blue-black, like that's kind of what the color was, and it was thick. It was almost like powder coat thick. And in order to break that injection pump off, you'll see very obvious that paint's all cracked and chipped away. If you look at your truck and you see that paint's all cracked and chipped away, I would probably recommend you to take those 3 10 millimeter bolts, drop the fuel like linkage off the side of the injection pump, take a picture of it, get the Bosch 10 digit, and let's make sure we give you the right timing specs and whatnot for that pump. Because, example, if you've got a 160 pump, the profile of the pump is totally different than that of a 180 or 215 pump. So if we tell you this many millimeters of lift is going to give you 22 degrees of timing, but we don't know that you've had a pump swap, it's not going to be even close to that. It might not even start. And then we're going to be like, man, I know that I've set this thing at 22 degrees. Well, you said X amount of millimeters of lift, but since you don't have the right pump, that's not that many degrees. It might be minus 30. Like, we don't know until we know exactly where your injection pump is. So if there is a question mark, then drop that linkage off, take a picture of that. You can email that in, we can help you at that point. But yes, that's how I would kind of go about that. So
I would like to say that is important to remember. We can help you rebuild and repurpose or enhance the P-pump that you do have now, if you're going to be going that route. So after that, we figured out what kind of pump you do have. We know if you have an automatic or manual transmission now. A lot of times people want me to help them choose the correct injector, and a lot of times the correct turbo also, because they're doing both at the same time. And that one's a little bit more difficult to know depending on what their power level goals are. So I usually start with that, but how would you help a customer pick his injector turbo combo, knowing what kind of pump they have and what they're trying to do with the truck?
Okay, so awesome question. Say when this truck was brand new, the flange on the exhaust manifold was a T3 flange. And on a 5.9 with a 2-valve head, that's a pretty efficient flange. But if this is going to be kind of a hot rod that's going to spin above 4,000 RPM pretty often, I would instantly be looking at like one of BD's exhaust manifolds, or possibly even, I don't know if ATS does or doesn't, they might not for that application. Any aftermarket manifold that has a T4 flange for a 12-valve head, and then I would upgrade, I would be telling them, hey, look, you're going to spin this kind of RPM. I would be looking at changing the manifold to a T4 and selecting a turbocharger with a T4 foot. So as RPM increases, so does air volume and velocity. You'll decrease the velocity, the turbine housing will crack less, exhaust manifold is going to last longer, and you're going to get better overall exhaust gas temperature control at the bigger RPM because of the bigger foot. If it's somebody's kind of a, like say a work stock truck, the factory turbocharger will make, let's talk about wastegates and factory turbos. So this little guy right here is a jet that's restricted down on the inside to a size that we've prescribed. And on the side there's a bleed orifice. And this goes and it basically blocks off all of the air, not all, it allows some, to go to the factory's wastegate actuator, increasing boost by increasing drive pressure.
So you're keeping the wastegate closed
longer. At a given point, this starts to crack open and the wastegate starts to bleed off. So as drive pressure increases, this little guy allows that wastegate to then crack open later. And as horsepower and EGT start to like all match up, wastegate cracks open and then drive pressure starts to come down, but engine RPM is coming back up. So drive pressure kind of hangs. If you just reach in there with a pair of pliers and pinch off the wastegate hose, you're still going to see about 32 to 34 pounds of boost maximum efficiency out of that factory compressor. But drive pressure could be as high as 70 or 80 until you finally spin the thing to where it just blows up. The other problem is when the exhaust valve opens, chamber goes boom, air tries to leave the exhaust valve, and the manifold is now an accumulator with 80 pounds of air pressure into it. There's not a lot of volume leaving the cylinder because there's so much air pressure in the bloody exhaust manifold. So the wastegate, just pinching it off to make more boost, you don't realize what you're really doing if you're just looking at the one number. You're probably hurting the vehicle's performance even though it's making 50 pounds of boost. 50 pounds of boost with that little tiny compressor is, the intake air is horribly hot. Air density is totally gone. And drive pressure is probably 2 to 2.5 to 1 of boost. So don't do that. Like, use this little guy, keep the turbocharger alive, keep the head gasket longer, and if you had a pair of rollers in the ground that you could dyno it, I guarantee that I can make your factory turbocharger make more power with this than just pinching off the wastegate. So if they're going to increase turbocharger, ATS has this little Aurora 3000. I've sold a pile of those things throughout the years. It's a T3 foot. It's a 57 millimeter little billet wheel. They've got a really cute little comp cover that works awesome. Bear in mind, a 2-valve head doesn't have a lot of the characteristics that the common rails do. So trying to get the turbocharger chosen correctly, if you're going to be that 350 to about 500, 525 horsepower guy, I really like the ATS Aurora 3000. BD has kind of a variant of BorgWarner's S300G. They call it, they're like Super B. It's 57 millimeter compressor wheel, it's a cast wheel. They use the 0.80 turbine housing with the 65 millimeter turbine wheel. Same turbine wheel as the Aurora 3000, so it's kind of based off the S200 frame, both those chargers. They work out really good, clear up to, like I say, low 5s, high 4s. And there again, choosing the injector size correctly is a big deal because we're trying to basically make sure that we have plenty of time for the injector to do its thing and cylinder to process the fuel, burn the fuel, and then exhaust valve open. If we get the injector too bloody big, no matter where we put our fuel cam plate, whenever you go to start the thing and it's not making any EGT, it's just like flooding the crankcase out with the diluted, you're going to dilute the crankcase oil. It's not going to run very good in the cold temperatures, and if you live at a high elevation or if you can travel to high elevation to go camping or hunting and things like that, it's going to be a miserable mess. Bear in mind, you just set your pump timing to whatever it is, it's there at every single RPM. So if you try and choose an injector that's too small, if you're trying to make 500 horsepower on a stock injector, stock injectors about 37 liters is a P477 nozzle. It's like 37 liters of air per minute was that injector nozzle. 145 degrees spray angle, they used a 1.5 millimeter copper, so the nozzle protrusion wasn't very good. And if you take that, I've done a bunch of stuff with that. If you try and make 500 horse to that nozzle, you can if you've got a really hot injection pump. But now the line pressure is going to be really, it's a lot. And you're going to have to lean on the cam plate a lot to try and get the factory injector to make 500 horsepower. So it's, even though it can be done, it's not the most efficient way to do it, because now you're just, if we talk like in electronic land, like I always tell you, like at that RPM, you're only going to want this many microseconds. When you start advancing the cam plate forward, basically you're doing a mechanical version of enhancing the pulse width. And by enhancing pulse width, you're now chasing the piston down the hole. As the piston's traveling away from the nozzle, you're just chasing it with more and more fluid, so it gets really smoky and really hot. So I'd say, like I said, stage 1 or stage 2s for like a 500 horse truck with that like 57 to 60 millimeter compressor inducer. And then if they're trying to do something a bit more than that, like let's just say they're going to go from say 550 up to about 750 horsepower, on a 2-valve head on the street, I'm going to highly recommend a set of compounds at this point, because it is a 2-valve. We're now going to have to bump up the timing a little bit more, which means that the throttle response on the bottom end is going to kind of go away. And if I choose a turbocharger that's going to make 750 horsepower, we're going to be around the 71 millimeter compressor inducer, and it's not going to be very fun on a 2-valve P-pump truck to drive on the street. It's going to make 750 when you're wide open throttle, but getting it to make 750 is going to be kind of a hot, smoky mess.
So I had a customer call just recently, right actually before that we started sitting down, asking about what injector to use for basically what you're describing right now. It's a compound kit with manifold, and it was a 58 millimeter
on the
chassis on the manifold.
Yep.
And then a 478 or 472 over the top.
Okay.
However, the pump was timed at 26 degrees, 215, maxed out pump, flowing about 650 cc's. He asked what injector I thought would be good for him.
I'd say a stage, again, elevation and the rest of the truck.
It's in Bremerton,
Washington.
Yep.
So elevation's 0. He's like next to sea level. Air density's really good because it's never very hot there. Is it lifted on 38s or is it kind of a street
big truck? Lifted, big truck, kid with more money than he knows what to do with.
Not for long. I would say that he would be a stage 2 guy. He's in Bremerton, Washington, where smoke is not welcome at all. He's gonna, with stage 2s and a 215 pump, he has the potential, depending on cam plate profile and where he's got the cam plate, he's got the potential to make probably 750 to 800 horsepower with those injectors. He doesn't need an injector any bigger because of where he lives, and because, you know, he's going to spend a lot of time bumper to bumper.
It was a manual transmission truck as well.
Okay, that'll help, because when he's bumper to bumper traffic in an auto truck, the more power you're making, the hotter the converter gets, because it has to sit there and slip against it. Or you've got to be one of those guys that, like, you're in drive, you move 17 feet, and you pop it in neutral, and you sit there and you wait, and you wait, and you wait, and then you pop it back into drive, and then you go 17 more feet. Since he's a 5-speed guy with, you know, manual, that helps a lot for traffic. But again, he's got to row gears. So it's like second gear to third gear, and then reboost in between gears. I'd say the smaller the injector, the better for that guy. So I'd go with the stage 2s on 215 pump twisted up. There's a couple of really good pump shops over on that side of the country. And if he's using the same guys that we used to use when we were over there, I'm sure the pump's really good. And a set of 2s with that size injector would be all he really needs.
Okay, that's good enough. I told him I'd come get you. So that kind of brings us, we talked about heat now, you just kind of passed on, and that was actually the third question that I get a lot, is guys that have too much of it. And so they're wanting to know, with these injectors, what kind of EGTs should I expect, and how can I lower them?
So there's two things about diesel fuel. There's the lean side of the curve, where you can make horsepower on the lean side of the curve, and that's going to be like the Gale Banks side. Like no smoke, optimizing horsepower with the given amount of fuel that we're putting into the motor. And then on the lean side, you can really start to get hot. I used to tell people, like, in our race trucks, we would run them at like 1650, 1700 degrees, and we're cracking the cylinder head, but the pistons last. But our race trucks only do something for, like, say 9, 10, a sled pull truck's wide open throttle for about 12 to 14 seconds.
And if you're one of our guys, sometimes one time.
But that's for like seconds.
Right.
If you're dragging your boat with your camper and your kids and your dog all the way up the mountain pass, you're going to need to be in that 1300 degrees VGT all the way up the pass. And then you're going to have your EGT, check, got it. The next thing to look at is coolant. No matter what your EGT is, if your coolant, if you can't manage water temperature, then you're still going to boil the water. It's still going to get hot. You're still going to stick a piston. You're still going to hurt rings. I would highly recommend that if anybody's loaded real heavy, whether it's, you know, a hot shot kind of a guy that does this on the daily, or just the weekend warrior that's going to be loaded 15, 18,000 pounds once in a while, you get 210, 220, that's it. And at that point, you need to start backing off the gas pedal and slowing down. If chronically you're always boiling that thing to 210, 220, one of the things with that era of truck had a viscous fan clutch in it, and back in the old day, when it locked up, you would hear it sound like just like an airplane, just all the air sucking through the radiator, and then it would cool off. That viscous fan clutch, even those things, they don't last forever.
Right.
So if you get in and the truck's stone cold, and you can take your thumb and go and spin that fan, and it still goes another 6 or 8 inches, the fan clutch is going to be worn out. Go to Napa, go to your local parts house, buy a new fan clutch, change that out, and you'll fix a bunch of water temperature issues just doing that. If you've got a good fan clutch, coolant system's efficient and not plugged up, nothing's wrong, and you still can't manage coolant temperature, timing can fix that. If you're fighting EGT all the time, my high recommendation is going to be rent some dyno time and somebody that knows what's up. Start monkeying with the timing to where you find the sweet spot. The curve looks perfect, everything turns out great. You'll notice fuel economy, the EGT control, and coolant will be cooler as well. How many degrees is that, Len? Just tell me the number. I don't know. If you're one of the poor guys that bought open bowl pistons and you're driving a marine bowl piston on the street, I'm sorry, your truck's never going to run right.
Yeah, I do have that question.
It's horrible. Like, those pistons were good in a boat. And in a boat, the captain goes, "We free?" "Yep." And then the boat is in the water with prop load, static load, not loaded for 12, 14, 16 hours, whatever it is, but it's loaded. And it's got engine coolant that is the ocean to cool off turbine housings and engine and all that stuff, just flooded with cool water all the time. So the reason why the reduced compression piston was a good deal back then is because A, you couldn't change timing. And B, if you tried to make a 17-to-1 motor live in a boat for 3 days traveling from, say, Seattle to Alaska at steady load like that, it's not going to work. Cummins couldn't have made a 375 horsepower at a 17-to-1 motor. So they reduced it down to about 15 and a half. Putting those pistons in a street-driven pickup truck, it has its place, but it's over 800 horsepower. When you get to 800 horsepower, you've got enough turbocharger and enough boost pressure with enough intake air temperature that at certain parts of the throttle, those pistons will live longer because you've reduced cylinder pressure. As RPM goes up and as power goes up, cylinder pressure goes up. So 15, 16 years ago, they got to be really popular. People started converting to marine style pistons. And I noticed when I bought my first motor, we built my first motor with marine pistons, it was a turd. It was constantly 1,000 degrees. It was constantly 1,200 degrees. And I was on the dyno trying to set timing to get this thing to run right. Compression was down, mileage was down, EGT was up, smoke control was out the window. And by the time I finally gave it enough timing, injection timing, to get it to really rip, it was 27 degrees. And then the harmonics at 27 degrees, stupid things start falling off the motor. Like the transfer case would vibrate free. The little bolt that holds the dipstick in would just pop out, and I'd open the hood, the dipstick would be hanging up in the air. So I really don't recommend people try and street drive those. We've got fasteners that are really good today. 20 years ago we didn't. 20 years ago, we went to Cummins, we bought a bag of $200 worth of bolts, we pulled them, and that was what we had. Today we've got ARP fasteners, we've got really good stuff that's way stronger, and we've got a lot more experience. So compression is your friend on the street. It makes throttle response, and it makes fuel economy, and it helps you with smoke control. And that's been something that I've fought, because on the internet, well, we had a guy that was really dissatisfied with us weeks ago.
Yeah, it was Monday.
Oh,
you mean the gentleman that rebuilt his own engine?
Yeah, that guy, yeah.
He's fun.
Yeah, that was fun. That was entertaining. So, 400,000 mile motor, doesn't hone it, doesn't bore it, doesn't do anything, just jumps on eBay, buys a set of Cummins 5.9 pistons, has no idea what the compression ratio is, has no idea what the bowl is, throws them in the driveway, buys a set of our injectors, and it runs horribly. Yes, that is true. It will. Well, why? Is yours not shaped for my bowl? I don't even know what bowl you have. But I do know that if you over-richen something that's not being burnt, it's going to give you the shooting ducks out the tailpipe when you try and rev it up. There's not enough cylinder pressure. And I could have fixed that problem, but in the long run, he said, hey, look, I put my stock injectors in it and this thing just rips. That's true, because you've eliminated 20-25% of fluid volume under no load, and it's not going to do the duck fart and all that stuff. But you've still got a motor that's worn out. It was 400,000 miles old. You didn't bore it. You didn't resize it. You didn't fit it. You didn't even hone it. I wanted out of that. So I offered just give him his money back, let him go. It's going to be a lesson learned the long way, but compression is your friend, and just throwing pistons is something doesn't, and he wouldn't even opt to do, DJ, the guy that sold me injectors, offered to do a compression check free of charge just to help him understand what he'd done. And the guy was like, absolutely not, I'm not wasting more time or effort on this, just give my damn money back. Okay, take your money, go. Some people you can't realize, you just can't, they're smarter than everybody else, and they don't want to know that what they just spent their week doing was incorrect. If you don't know, ask somebody. I will gladly help you. If you can't get me on the phone immediately, let Donnie know. Fill out a customer injector form. Do anything to try and get my attention around here. I will gladly help anybody out that I can on the street, building you what you want. Don't build what your neighbor down the street who married the gal that delivered the newspaper. Don't build anybody else's truck. Build yours.
Yeah, I think too it's important. It may feel like a lot of questions, and you may not know the answers to them right away, and it may feel like I'm trying to diminish the situation by just asking hard questions, but we're really trying to make sure you have the best experience. And a lot of these questions that he's answering for me right now, I had to learn for the first time too, and you're going to have to learn them for the first time if you want your truck to be what you think it should be or what you want it to be.
Don't build anything based off of a number. Call us up and let us know what you're trying to build. I tow horses. My wife is hot. I can't replace her. If I stain her horse trailer, she'll leave me. We need to know. If we know all of the facts of what you're trying to do, we can get you. And actually this morning, I was at the other shop. Snap-on guy showed up, dropped off toolbox, and he's like, man, what do you think is a manageable number on the street? And we were looking at Skylar's race truck, which is a common rail, and I looked at it and I go, well, with that truck, it's 5.9. I said, like 1,200 is kind of the limit. Because if we put bigger turbochargers on it to make more than 1,200 on the street, the turbochargers get to be so big, it's not very fun on the street. So from stoplight to stoplight, pulling away from the post office box, stopping to get donuts, which I do often. All of those things, the throttle response isn't there, and I feel like throttle response is what makes them fun to drive.
Yeah.
So is a 1,200 horsepower P-pump really practical to drive on the street? Not so much. Because now you have to be up at that 26, 28, 30 degrees of injection timing. You've got a really good size injector in there to make that kind of power, and you've got a good size set of turbos. Will it live on the street? Probably. Will it be fun to drive? It's not going to be like a 6.7 at 1,200 horse that drives the heck out of turbochargers, still has a ton of throttle response, still has awesome fuel economy, remote start works, everything's great, like that kind of stuff. But there again, a 6.7 is the more fragile of the motors when you start leaning on them, because you've got the same base footprint, there's just less iron in it to keep it all together. So if you're going to try and build a 6.7 at 1,200 horse, it's not going to live. Barring deck plates and really good parts, girdles and whatnot, just the block, a 6.7 block, 800 horse on the street is a really fun truck to drive. It's not going to live that long, especially when you hear your professional say, yeah, like so-and-so's driving 1,000 horse daily. So-and-so might, but I bet so-and-so's not going to drive it like it's stolen every single day. If you plan on driving stuff like it's stolen every day, transmissions, like tires, engines, all of it gets broken. So, yeah, again, you tell us what you want to drive, what tire size is. We're going to recommend gears. We're going to recommend all sorts of stuff. It's critical to build. What's a brand new truck today?
65, 70,000.
So a brand new Ford, when I priced one out, like when I just did the build sheet, was $100K.
That's for your truck.
I wanted a brand new pimped out F-350, blah, blah, blah. And then I bought my Cummins, which was my Ram, which came out to like $86,000. And if they're not built in the States, pretty soon they're going to have a big tariff on them, which takes an $85,000 truck and puts that to like $114,000 for a pickup. Like my first house wasn't that.
Right.
And I lived in it. Like I had barbecues in the backyard. It had a fence. It had
friends.
A garage. Yeah. Friends could show up. Like, this being said, if you own a truck that you kind of like, and you've got it to where you really enjoy it, you've got the stereo set up in it, you've got the amenities in it that you really enjoy, investing, let's just say it's a $25,000 truck, $30,000 truck, $5,000 truck, investing something into it to make it better than it's ever been for you and your application. I'm building my truck. I'm not building yours. I'm not going to marry your wife, A, because you're already married, and B, because you chose her for all the things in your personality that you needed about your gal. You're probably not going to want to marry anybody I'm going to marry because I like to wake up early. You don't. There's things about all of us. Don't just say, hey, look, so-and-so's driving a 1,000 horsepower truck. I want to drive a 1,005 horsepower truck. Don't do it. Like, just build what you want.
And we're going to make it last. It's important, too.
Man, that's a big deal. And by going, I know that, we do injectors and people get tired of, me saying injector, 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 injector. When tuning and boxes and plug and plays are so easy, it frustrates people when they're like, what's the right way to do it? And I say, pull the injectors out.
Right. Send them in, let me look at them.
But I can just plug a box in it. You can. VP44 was 98.5 to 02. You plug a box in it, you don't check fuel pressure, and you kill the injection pump in like 5.6 minutes. And then you call up and you're like, what did I do wrong? What was the fuel pressure? I don't know. That's what you did wrong. When you plug a box in to a VP44, you need to, number one, make sure that you've got a good, reliable fuel source. Make sure that you never see below 5 pounds of fuel supply pressure. I'm not telling you to go check the fuel pressure in your driveway at idle. I'm telling you to tape a gauge to the windshield and get on it and go past a semi-truck. Do what you got to do to get to wide open throttle, because that's when the most volume is being passed through the system. And if the injection pump can make 13 pounds at idle, but it makes 0 at wide open throttle, guess when it dies? Passing a semi-truck. So we need to make sure that when people are checking fuel pressure, P-pumps no lower than 20 PSI ever, and that's at wide open throttle. With a VP44, no lower than 5 ever, period. If you plug a box into a VP44, you duty cycle the injection pump harder, trying to make it squirt through a stock injector. You can look like edge monitors. You've got a fuel temperature sensor in that, and you can see the fuel temperature rise, and the injection pumps inherently failed way more often. I guarantee you, if you bought a VP44, put just a reman pump from any good, normal, good supplier of injection pump, put a set of injectors in it and one of the boost foolers, do not plug a box into it, do not tune it, do not do anything. Just a set of 75s, wastegate elbow, or the little J-hook thing. You're asking the pump to work less hard. You're still going to get the desired amount of horsepower that you want. it'll idle. Those trucks are horrible, like at the McDonald's parking lot or the McDonald's drive-through. They're horrible. They rattle so bad. You put injectors in them, it smooths them right out. It's a lot quieter. The injection pump temperature drops. The injection pump, I guarantee, will live over 100,000 miles.
Yeah, I think that people are often surprised when we tell them to pull their tuner out, because what we're doing is designed to work in your factory application with just small modifications. But pull that tuner out, let it do what it was supposed to do for the factory, live longer with the correct injector.
The 47RE or the clutch that was in the NV 4500, the clutch kicks free prior to 300 brewable horsepower, and the 47RE stock with torque converter that was in it stock starts to really fail at about 275 horsepower. Plus, back then, Chrysler wasn't super smart, so they put 355s in everything. Like you had a special order 410s. The sweet spot would have been a 373 for that application. 355's mechanical leverage against transmission is not...
Yeah, from the stop.
Yeah, it's not good. Yes, going down the road at 1700 engine RPM at 60 miles an hour is nice, but trying to get to speed was hard on those trannies. You put a set of, like, let's just say it's a 215 or a 235 or a 245 rated truck. They all dyno 185 to about 205 at the rear tires. A set of 50s puts you really close to the top of the turbocharger. A set of 75s, it could potentially put you over the top of what I would recommend somebody runs the factory turbocharger at, and it's definitely going to hurt the clutch very, very short time, and or the transmission. Yeah. You can do slight modifications to tranny to make it live better, but if you're not going to do the transmission modifications at the same time as the engine mods, transmission is not going to live. So, again, why would I get rid of my box? I've had my box for 5 years. I understand, sir, but unless you're going to get it on a dyno and figure out how much power that thing actually makes, so you can go to your transmission shop and tell them, hey, look, this thing makes 325, it makes 330, it makes 350, it makes 400 at the tire. You're probably going to kill a tranny. So dynos are a big deal. It's not just like pound on my chest and say what I've got. Like, oh, I make 1,000 foot-pounds of torque. Great. But it's a tuning tool. Yeah. It is to try and put together, like, I see how much power I'm making at 2,000 RPM. I see how much power I'm making at 1,600. I see how much power I'm making at 3,200. Put the parts together to optimize and use those powers at that curve.
And you're going to know how much heat you're going to have. You're going to know a lot of things.
You know a lot. Yep. So, what else? I think we're getting long-winded now.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing we could go over maybe on the next video is to remind people that I'm not really concerned with what you're going to do in the future. I'm going to build you an injector for what you're going to do today. And maybe talk about some more things later. But yeah, it's been a good video. I've
told you stories about people that call up and order injectors and then they never even got to build the truck like they were going to and they melted it.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that in the next episode. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Lenny Reed, Dynomite Diesel.
And I'm Donnie.